In this video, I'm going to show you how to recycle a surfboard with sustainable materials because of the increasing need to address climate change and eliminate harmful processes used in the manufacturing of surfboards. Climate change is real and is responsible for extreme climate events like the California wildfires, as seen in this midday video of the surf. I started surfing when I was around 8, and this is one of the first photos of me standing up. As I've grown up, I've continued to surf, but I have also noticed the increased pollution in our oceans and on our beaches. With action, we can ensure that people can still enjoy the ocean like I do. This is my first attempt at shaping an eco-surfboard, let alone a surfboard. I'm not an accomplished builder, so you are learning along with me. Join me in being part of the solution. I'm recycling a 25-year-old 9.4 Harbor high-performance longboard that is ready for a new life. I would like to point out that due to the additional weight that will come from the wood, this process is best for turning a board into a more traditional longboard. Here you can see some of the pressure dings and patches that have accumulated over the years. To start, I stripped the wax off the board and started sanding the fiberglass down to see if that would ease the removal of the fiberglass. I used a Dremel on the already sanded down fiberglass to create an opening for me to peel the glass off. This Dremel work clearly will give you a few cuts in the foam, but this isn't a big deal as we can easily fill them later. This Dremel was also extremely brittle, so if you have another tool that would give you better accuracy, feel free to use that. Here's me peeling up the first strip of fiberglass with a flathead, and I definitely developed a better technique through the process, but this was the first piece. Because sanding fiberglass releases a lot of toxic chemicals into the air, I tested the Dremel on a non-sanded area to see if we could avoid sanding the glass. Disregarding my poor peel, this method worked just as well as the sanded down version, so this was definitely a positive experiment as we were able to avoid some toxicity. So there are some areas where there are more layers of fiberglass than others, like the tail and the rail, just for more stability, which made the peeling a bit harder, but it wasn't too bad, and to my surprise, the peeling off the stringer wasn't bad. It's just in this clip, the fiberglass cut at the stringer. Here is an example of what the pressure dings look like when the glass is stripped. The foam came off with the glass, which left me with some holes that I'll have to fill later. So you can see here there have been lots of pressure dings, and the foam just came up with the fiberglass when I stripped it off, compared to here when there were not many dings. So yeah, I will try to fill some of them, but these aren't that bad, so I'll try to sand them down. This is the board completely stripped of the glass. The main problem area in this was stripping the rails. They had a lot of layers of fiberglass, so when pulled off, they brought a significant amount of foam. This won't matter too much as we will later be taking the rails down to a square edge in order to laminate the rail wood on. For the overall shape of this board, I want to transform it into more of a classic longboard shape with a square tail and a more rounded nose. So the seemingly messy nose, and especially tail, will mostly be cut off to make the board around 9 feet. Here I am using a pole saw to cut the nose into a more rounded shape. The next step is to focus on the rails. In order to laminate wood onto them, as we will do in the future, they need to be squared. I'm using this carpenter's technique to trace around the rails so we can cut this off. Mind you, it will be built back with wood. And this is what the board looks like traced with red ink. Now I'm going along the rails with a pole saw to trim them. As you can see, I'm not that skilled with a pole saw, so in some spots it's not that horizontal, but for the most part they are squared. Next, I'm using a Surform to smooth down the rails. The foam is really delicate, so it is really important you use long, fluid strokes so that you do not create any divots in your blank with this tool. I am also taking down the classic Harbor nose channels because it would be very difficult to laminate wood onto them. I also filled in the fin boxes. I'm going to make this board a single fin, so I used wood to fill in the middle fin so I could later cut into a more stable material to install my single fin. To fill any dings to prepare for the lamination of the deck, I mixed together my eco-resin and foam dust from sanding. The foam is an easy recycled filler that is much easier than patching with just resin or solid foam. As you can see, I am mixing some foam and just mix that until you get a paste that looks somewhat like this. Here I am patching one of my bigger dings, so you just place on the paste like so, and then you use a squeegee to even it out. Keep in mind that you will need to slightly sand it down when it dries. I felt that I needed a better stand for my board, so I installed my surf racks from my bike into my dad's table with permission, and it works great. This can most likely be modified with any materials you have at home. Next, I prepared to trace the foam blank onto the Meranti Hydrotech ply that I am using for the deck. I clamped down each end of the board and then traced the board about 1/4 of an inch away from the foam. I then used a jigsaw to cut out the traced wood. The footage is a bit shaky, but this process is pretty self-explanatory. To prepare for the vacuum bag, I decided that I wanted to minimize the rocker on this board. Since the vacuum bag impresses so much weight, I needed to find a middle ground between a completely flat board and a lot of rocker. I placed 2 materials with different heights under the board to see which amount of rocker works best for me. With the desired rocker, I taped the recycled foam onto the board that I'm going to put in the vacuum bag. I also did the same in front and behind that board because the vacuum bag places so much pressure onto the board, I did not want it to cave in without stability. For further prep with the vacuum bag, I am sealing it with putty and using a bag that my dad had already had, which was really convenient. This is the length of the bag. I am using a vacuum press pump because, again, I already had that. The vacuum bag works by removing air molecules, which makes the atmospheric pressure evident. The atmospheric pressure impresses about 370 pounds per square inch upon the board, which in turn causes the air to be drawn out of the cells, which are in the surface structure of the wood. The resin then gets sucked into these cells, creating a dependable bond. It was definitely a 2-person job getting the board into the bag, so here's me and my dad sliding it in. Once the press is turned on, pulling the sides out and making sure everything's in place is really important. You don't want the bag to form where it shouldn't. Also, just to explain what is on top of the board, I put down plastic so the resin didn't stick to the bag, and then breather cloth for even airflow. As the vacuum bag began, I quickly realized that the tail was not supported enough. The sides were caving in, as you can somewhat see in the video. I took the board out, as it hadn't fully formed yet, and quickly added new foam blocks underneath the tail, and then put it back in for round 2. Here you can see a bit of a double concave forming, but for the most part that sprung back. After the resin cured, I was finally able to take it out of the bag. As my dad jokes, it is just like Christmas. It takes a few minutes for the bag to loosen up, but obviously just slide it out when ready. And here, that's what I'm doing. It might get stuck in the bag, and in that case you might have to climb in, but I was pretty lucky. Here, I'm just taking off the plastic and breathers. As you can see, especially well at the tail, the resin bled through, which is a good sign that it bonded really well. However, it might impact what the final finish looks like in those spots. And here's how the bottom deck turned out. Any problem spots for the most part sprung back, but if you take away anything from this video, know that it is essential to block the board with honestly anything you have. As I have said before, I just use recycled foam. This is the board fresh out of the bag, and you can see visible dings that the blocking foam or board underneath the surfboard impressed into the foam. I then trimmed down the edges to prepare for the lamination of the second deck because it would be hard to trim both edges at the same time. As you can see here, the way the vacuum bag laminated the tail left a gap here. I filled a syringe with resin and pumped it in there and then clamped it all together. And this is how I clamped it. With everything I had to do for the bottom deck, I had to do for the top. So since the plywood came in 4x8 pieces, I had to glue the remaining length to the 4x8 piece for a 9-1 board. So here I'm just doing that. And then to fasten it together, I used tape by just stretching one side of the tape down. And that pretty much clamps them together. And this is what it looks like when it's finished. So I cut that out and then started to prepare the blocking for the vacuum bag. After some trial and error, I ended up blocking the foam like so, making sure that they were close enough together so there wouldn't be any dips in the board itself. And here's the vacuum bag for the top deck. One side of the vacuum bag with all of the edges trimmed, I used a belt sander to smooth and square the edges. An orbital sander can definitely be used as well, but I think the belt allows for more accuracy when you are trying to level out the rails, and just long strokes will get you that desired shape. I then started to work on the rails. I cut my mahogany 2x10 planks into 1/8 strips. This means since I cut off 1/2 inch of foam rails, I will have 4 strips of the mahogany on the rails. The mahogany can also be pretty toxic when being cut or sanded, so be sure to use proper protection wear. I first started with the tail. I tested how far the wood would bend and marked it at that point and cut it. Then I used my eco resin and clamped them on like so. Now it was time to start on the nose. In order to bend the 1/8 wood around the nose without it breaking, I needed to steam it. I made a makeshift steam chamber by cutting up an unused flagpole. I placed the wood inside and waited for the water to boil, and then left the wood in for around 20 minutes. As resin does not cure on a damp surface, I molded the wood to the nose and waited for it to dry by using a rope clamp. Once the wood dried, I used the rope clamp as well as other forms of security such as a bike tire, because the curved surface created a lot of gaps, especially as you laminated more layers on. I used an orbital sander to sand the surface of my 2 pieces of mahogany that I glued together, as it is important to make sure that you are gluing onto a flat surface. Here is a shot of all the clamps on at once. As the gluing process is quite messy and rushed, I didn't get footage, but as you can infer, I just spread my eco resin onto the wood and then clamped them, making sure the wood covered all the rails. You might need another hand if you are clamping both sides at once. After I glued 2 layers of rails on, I decided to trim the wood, as I did not want to have more difficulty later trimming 4 layers of rails instead of just 2. As you can see by how much this video is sped up, this took a while. However, later in the process, you get in the rhythm and it goes by a bit quicker. As you will probably encounter, the resin sometimes does not cure properly, so just fill it with resin again and clamp it back together. After trimming, I started on the 3rd layer. As the layers progressed, more difficulty came with preventing gaps in the wood. Thus, more clamps and experimentation had to be done in order to clamp the wood properly. Also, as you can see in the middle, I added 2 layers of 1/16 maple wood because I feared I was running low on mahogany. And here's the 3rd layer of the rails glued down. This is the 4th layer of the rails curing. As you can see, much more experimentation took place with this last layer of the nose and how to clamp it. Once all the rails were on, I had to trim again. Using my pole saw, I just went around the rails, and as I said before, this is a bit time consuming. This is with the rails trimmed down. There were some high spots due to inaccurate trimming, so I just took a hand plane and shaved down those high spots, as it will make shaping the rails later on much easier. I also ended up not adding a final layer of wood to the nose because I knew that I would be shaping it down anyway. Because of this, I sanded the rails down to make this seam flush, as so. And so I began shaping. After some experimentation, I decided that using a saw rasp was going to be the best tool for me in this process. It worked faster than manually sanding, but also took less body strength, so I could do it for a while without getting tired. I also decided to shape 50-50 rails, so I drew a line down about the middle of the rail and shaped down to that on either side. As you can kind of see in the back, I brought in another board that I wanted my rails to be similar to, so I can compare them by touch. If you have another board you can compare to, I highly recommend this, as I have never shaped a surfboard rails before. It was good to have a guide. Once I had my desired shape, which I really just had to tell by feel, I sanded around the seam between the rails and the deck to make it flush. I used a sanding block for this and used long fluid strokes as to not get any divots. You can also use a sanding block to shape the rails themselves, but I had a saw rasp, so I did that instead. After all of that, I had sanded the rest with 80 grit and proceeded up to 320 grit sandpaper. Here is an aerial of the board after the rails have been shaped, and this is a view from the side. Now it was time to make the tail block. I gathered together some extra mahogany and some maple wood that I already had in the shop to make this beautiful pattern. I glued them together and then cut off the tail. The tail block needed to be shaped to match the rest of the rails, so I hand sanded some of it, but for the most part I used a sanding block to make sure that the tail was even against the already shaped rails. Here is an image of the tail block shaped. Now I began to work on the fin. I decided to use a 10-inch Harbor single fin that I already had. However, I decided that I wanted a 9-inch fin, so I cut that down on the table saw, as well as cut in a fin plug using a scroll saw. I then used an orbital sander to sand down a few layers of the fiberglass. Make sure you are wearing a respirator as you are working with fiberglass. And here's the finished fin sanded down. To cut the hole for the fin, I used my dad's CNC router. This was clearly really convenient for me. However, if you don't have access to this, you could try carving out the hole and filling any gaps with recycled fiberglass. That's what comes to mind for me. And luckily, the fin fit really snug, so I coated it with resin and then fit it in. I decided I needed to do a pinstripe on this board, as the seam between the deck and the rails is what would be most susceptible to water coming in. I used tape to lay the line. This is the only footage I have of me doing it, and unfortunately, it was when I was still getting the hang of laying the tape down. Ideally, you would look down the line while placing it down. So I did the bottom deck, and I'm going to start off by saying I did not calculate enough. Luckily, the bottom deck is really flat, but as you can see, I was using really thick amounts of resin because I did not add enough pigment, so when it thinned out, the line would be translucent. Since I was using a lot of resin, in places that weren't flat, the resin would just drip down like so on the nose. I didn't really fix this pinstripe because I felt that there was enough resin to protect the seam from water, even if it wasn't that pretty, especially at the nose. But this is what it looks like throughout the whole board on the bottom, and overall not that bad. So I began by doing exactly what I did on the bottom for the top deck. However, because the top has much more shape to it, the resin just completely dripped off the deck. The failed pinstripe was then sanded down, and I started with the application you see in this video. Unfortunately, I do not have much footage from what I did on the top deck, but I essentially added much more pigment so I could add a thinner layer of resin on. I also added microspheres to thicken the resin just to further prevent any dripping. And now I began to work on the leash plug. Well, actually I guess it isn't really a plug in this instance. I started with some recycled fiberglass, and I would really like to point out that since this is an eco board, please do not go out and buy fiberglass for this. Instead, find some recycled fiberglass elsewhere. Anyway, I pulled out the strands until I felt like I had a good amount. I taped together one end and then dipped it all in resin, making sure to thoroughly coat every strand, and then I twisted it all up. Also, when you're twisting it up, make sure to not pull out that many strands, as it will just make your strand thinner. I placed the strand on top of a dowel to create a hole for where the leash will go in the future. Then I cut the strand at the tape mark. You will need to spread out the strands in sort of a bow tie formation, and that will hopefully hold your leash. If it's not strong enough when the resin cures, go ahead and add more fiberglass, or you could also tie some rope around it just to give it another layer of protection. And I think it also might be good if it was rope to rope friction instead of rope to fiberglass. So I might try that out in the future. So before I began coating the board with varnish, I wanted to add a small graphic. I'm going over this in the video just in case you guys want to do the same. I wanted an aquatic creature and thought this anglerfish I pulled from the web was perfect and definitely embodied a lot of this project's essence in my mind. Since I do not consider myself an artist, I traced this image using graphite paper, which gave me a clear stencil for painting. I then decided to use gouache for the paint because it is a non-toxic paint. So I just mixed up the colors that I liked and began to paint. And I'm actually in love with my anglerfish. I think it was so important in making this board more personal, other than the fact that I shaped it. I'm going to use Le Tonkinois for the finish on this board. It is a 2 to 3 century old Chinese formula made from tung and linseed oil and other natural renewable resources, and I'm really excited with this find. So the only surface that it cannot be applied over is silicone, so just be sure to check that your sandpapers do not contain any. This also means that you should not use tack cloth. I started by applying their extra penetrative varnish on first. This is meant for the first layer, but can also be used for the whole board. And I honestly think I was putting too much on here. Lake Tonk can be applied really thin, and also keep in mind that it does not show brush strokes, which is really exciting. So here is the top of the board coated with one coat of that extra penetrative varnish. In between coats, I sanded really lightly with 350 grit sandpaper, but I honestly don't think that this is necessary. And ideally, you would put 6 coats on, so this is the glossy finish you are left with. And after me talking for a really long time, we finally have the finished result. I'm so happy with how this board turned out. This finish allows for a bit of grip, but it's definitely less than wax, so I think I'll be adding some wax in the future, but it isn't completely necessary. I hope you took away something from this video, whether it be how to laminate a deck via a vacuum bag, or that we need to be progressing with environmentally friendly products in order to stop climate change and keep our world beautiful. I will be updating this video with footage of me surfing once I figure out how to do that without a GoPro. And as promised, here are the materials I used, and in the next slide, here are the tools I have used.